the founding of Africatown. Who founded Africatown, and from your perspective, and I have a follow-up to that because I want to tie that to the geopolitical of the time and the impacts to your point about the environmental injustices.
Yeah, I would say that when people talked about Africatown back in the late 1800s, they meant this small settlement of the survivors, a few dozen survivors of the Clotilda voyage.
About 32 to 35, I believe.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then over time, that name just kind of fell out of use. If you talk to a lot of older people who grew up in Africatown, what we call, if they grew up in Plateau, Magazine Point, they'll say, we didn't use that name when I was a kid. And then in the 70s, Henry Williams, neighborhood activist, sort of amateur historian, started to bring it back. He said, we gotta start using this name again and think of ourselves as one unit. You know, all these little neighborhoods, Magazine Point, Plateau, Happy Hill. Mm-hmm. And so now Africatown is larger than that original settlement.
That's interesting. So say that again, the evolution, because I think that's important that you share. So those 32, 35 started using that term, right? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. And, you know, journalists would use it. It was a curiosity to them. They were like, look at this African village, like all these people directly from West Africa who still speak African languages. They, you know, so Africatown.
And that was at that time referring to those 32 to 35 descendants that were collectively living together mm-hmm. and supporting each other.
Right. Yes. And there were other people, other Black people in this area surrounding them. People, I think probably others who worked for the mayors. We don't know much about this from the records, but there is oral history about this, saying that there had always, you know, there were people who had already lived there. There were people who came after the war, and it was always, I think it was always to some degree a melting pot. Obviously had a distinct sense of their own identity.
Okay, it was a melting pot, and then you said that the term stopped being used for a period of time. Mm-hmm. When did they stop using? Do you know around about when the term was stopped kind of being used and re-picked back up?
It's a good question. You know, the writer Albert Murray grew up in Africatown. He was born in Magazine Point. He was born in like 1918, and in his novels he refers to an area called African Hill, and that leads me to believe that when he was a kid, and because he changes the names of a lot of things, like Magazine Point becomes Gasoline Point, so African Hill was probably, you know, Africatown. So that leads me to believe that in the 1920s and 30s, when he was growing up, the name was still in use. You know, Cudjoe was still alive until 1935, so it's easy to imagine that name still would have been used.